Hello and welcome to the Command Phase. My name is Mark and thank you so much for joining me. Spearhead boxes are Games Workshop's discount offering to get you into an Age of Sigmar faction, typically priced at £87.50, €115 or $145, which are the prices they'll be compared against to determine the value. The only exception to this is the Sons of Behemat box, which is priced slightly higher, and I've taken that into account for the values of this video. In terms of breaking down each, we'll be looking to see what is in every box, the amount of points you can build from it from the very recent January points update, the value you get from each box compared to buying each unit separately from Games Workshop, if it's a good starting point for an army, and even if it's worth getting multiples. Plus, if you're just looking to find out how they fare in the Spearhead format, I've got you covered. Each is discussed and ranked in a tier list as of the latest December 2024 update, so you can jump into your next purchase with a little more information. Just to note, there are a few characters in these boxes that can't be bought separately anymore, so I used their prices from when you could, or estimated the best I can to get an accurate representation of the value inside. If you wanted to jump to a specific faction that you're most interested in, there will also be timestamps in the description below. So without any further ado, let's get stuck in. First up, we have the Blades of Khorne Spearhead, and inside this box you'll get the following: 1 Slaughter Priest with Hackblade and Wrathhammer, 3 Mighty Skull Crushers, 10 Blood Warriors and 10 Blood Reavers, which brings in a pretty respectable 690 points in total, putting it firmly in the top 10 from the 27 we are talking about today. In terms of value, it does come in at one of the lowest overall at 24%, which is mainly due to the age of the models in this army. Some are coming up to 11 years old at this point, but to be fair, they're still looking pretty good for a force and a fun hobby project. As boxes go, it's a pretty solid start. It's got a lot of good units that do get used in a variety of top lists if that's something you're looking into. That being said, if you don't want everything in this box, you may well be better off avoiding it as it's not the biggest of savings. You certainly won't want 2 of these boxes with all the other goodies the army has to offer in its expanded range, which I'm sure you'll want to add. In terms of Spearhead gameplay, this is one of the best, if not the best box currently in the game. It has a big army footprint that all start on the board from the beginning of the game, a good amount of recursion with the Blood Reavers, which you can also combo with the Slaughter Priest to gain Blood Tithe points. It's got plenty of extra movement in both hero phases with Murderlust, which can move in and out of combat. Alongside this, you've got cavalry that hits like an absolute truck with some of the best saves in the game. Plenty of mortal wound output both in and out of combat, and a good suite of enhancement for the majority of matchups. I mean, what more could you want from a combat army? Honestly, I'm surprised they didn't receive any changes in the most recent update in December, so if you're after a really good melee force to play in this format, I'm sure you'll have a great time with these. Moving into order now, we have the Cities of Sigmar Spearhead box, which contains 1 Free Guild Cavalier Marshal, 1 Ironwell Great Cannon, 5 Free Guild Cavaliers, and 10 Free Guild Steel Helms. This comes in at a total of 510 points, which is very much on the lower end of these Spearhead boxes. Granted, when it comes to value, you do get a massive 40%, which puts it into the top 5. Cities is an army that generally requires a lot of cheap units to make up the force, which is why you can see the discrepancy between the points and the value. Plus, the box contents are the new human sculpts of the army that got a refresh in 3rd edition, which explains why the value is so high. Overall, I'm a huge fan of the new human sculpts for the army, and they were the main reason why I jumped into Age of Sigmar at the end of last edition. The models have a ton of detail and customization options, which can be a positive with them looking so good, but with a lot of details to paint, they may be a little daunting for someone brand new to the hobby. Also, the Cavaliers were a little fiddly to put together, but overall you get a fantastic set of models in this box. Gameplay wise, it's a good start to a force. While top tier lists aren't running everything here right now, I'd still highly recommend picking one up, especially if you aren't interested in running the Dwarden or the Dark Elf aspects of the army. But be warned, this is a pretty expensive army to put together with its high model count. In terms of the Spearhead gameplay, the recent December update helped improve things a little, but it's still one of the lower end forces for me. They are one of the weaker forces in comparison to a fair number of the others, but can still earn victories with some careful gameplay. You have a decent amount of flexibility on how you play the force depending on if you end up as the attacker or the defender. Making sure you utilise defensive or aggressive battle tactics with your army ability, depending on whether you're the attacker or defender, can really help you over the course of the game. That and keeping the cannon alive is key to keeping up your damage output, especially if taking the Ironwell Discipline as your regiment ability to shoot again in the opponent's combat phase. This is still an enjoyable force to play with some amazing looking models, and if you like being the underdog or you want a bit more of a challenge when playing Spearhead, then this might be one to consider. Onto the Daughters of Khaine now, and inside the Spearhead box we have 1 Melusai Iron Scale, 10 Witch Elves which can also be built as Sisters of Slaughter, 5 Bloodstalkers which can also be built as Blood Sisters, and 5 Doomfire Warlocks. Depending on which models you build, this gives us between 550 and 590 points in total inside the box, which is on the lower end of the boxes shown today. In terms of value, it's also on the lower end at 30%, which is counteracted a little bit by the dual kits being pretty useful to allow you to build what you want and need, and the age of the models inside. So not too bad in the grand scheme of things. Honestly, this is a pretty good starting box for the faction. With there not being a huge number of kits in the range, having 3/4 of the non-hero units in this box does make it great value for money, especially if you like the snake side of the force. You do get a good character, snake options, chaff, and a fast wizard scoring unit. So a good amount of diversity here in unit types. This is potentially even good enough to get a second if you can find something to do with the Iron Scale, as you won't need more than one. All of these models I've seen in a fair number of lists these days, so if you're thinking of starting Daughters of Khaine, you really can't go wrong with a box to get you started. In terms of the Spearhead format, this is a highly mobile glass cannon of a force which excels at picking advantageous fights. You have a lot of damage at range as everything shoots except the Witch Elves. The Witch Elves also deal a good amount of damage on the charge, but expect to lose them afterwards. Mobility is one of your biggest strengths for scoring in different parts of the board. That and having recursion of 3 of your 5 units is really helpful, but it's crucial to only lose one of these units at a time. Protecting your units that can't come back is an absolute must, being the linchpins of your force. And one thing to note is the low survivability across the Spearhead does punish mistakes. If you enjoy a glass cannon style force with a lot of mobility, I'm sure you'll enjoy this Spearhead. Learning how much you need to commit to wipe high priority threats is key to the force. While not top tier, they can certainly be competitive in the right hands. The Disciples of Tzeentch are up next, and inside their Spearhead box you get 1 Magister on Disc of Tzeentch, 3 Screamers of Tzeentch, 5 Flamers of Tzeentch, 10 Tzaangors, and 10 Kharak Acolytes. In terms of points, the box is coming in with 590 points, which isn't too bad, while in terms of value we're looking at 31% discount compared to buying everything separately directly from Games Workshop. This box I'm honestly not too sure about. While the majority of the units have been seen in a few lists, granted not together, it feels like more of an unfocused box for what the army wants to do. You do get a bit of everything with a unit of mortals, Tzaangors, and then demons, where it may have been a better pickup if it focused on more than one. That being said, if you're starting out and not sure which path you'd like to go, it's a solid discount box with a good number of models and units that enable you to play the Spearhead format while deciding how you want to go forwards. Speaking of the Spearhead game, this force sadly sits in the bottom tier for me. Their Destiny Dice is a nice mechanic to help with ensuring certain rolls happen when you need them to, and they have some good damage when it connects, especially at range, although the lack of rend is a pretty big problem. Sadly, having no reinforcements on some pretty fragile units isn't a great combination. The only recursion you get is through Transient Form's Regiment ability and the Bolt of Change on your Magister, and even then you need to make sure things die in a certain order to make it work, which is pretty tough to pull off. That's not to say you won't have any fun playing this, and if this is the aesthetic and army you'd like to collect, obviously go for it. just expect a bit of an uphill struggle for now and hope that Games Workshop give them a little bit of help in the next balance update. Moving on now to the Flesh Eater Court Spearhead box, and we get inside 1 Abhorrent Archregent, 1 Varghulf Courtier, 3 Morbeg Knights, and 10 Cryptguard. This gives us 600 points in total, which is around middle of the pack in terms of points we can expect from these boxes. Value wise, it's a little lacking at only 24%, which is one of the lowest overall. So it's safe to say if you don't want everything inside this box, then it's probably not worth picking up. As a box itself, these are units that most lists want to take, and being some of the newer sculpts too, they all look fantastic. For someone thinking about starting this army, it's certainly worth grabbing. The narrative is great for this faction, plus you'll have a fantastic time on the hobby side of things too, with these amazing looking sculpts. Also to note, there are still a fair number of the Christmas battle forces around too, so could be a great second pickup to really flesh out your army at a good discount. In terms of how it plays in the Spearhead format, you've got access to a really solid force with a high skill ceiling. There is a lot of melee damage throughout the force, and plenty of high self-sustain built in too, with recursion through noble deeds. It is an extremely mobile force, being able to retreat for free and charge afterwards is a fantastic mechanic to have. Varghulf being able to self-heal and retreat for free if it killed any models can allow it to achieve battle tactics very late on in the turn if needed. While they're not quite a glass cannon of a force, they certainly don't want to take a punch if they can help it. Honestly, this is a really fun force that has a good number of different tools at your disposal. It has an amazing amount of movement, and with careful positioning can be a real menace on the battlefield. Next up, we have the Fyreslayers Spearhead, which includes 1 Battlesmith, 5 Hearthguard Berserkers, which can alternatively build as Orruk Hearthguard, and 20 Volkite Berserkers. This can build you between 470 and 510 points depending on the unit options and loadouts you pick. As for the value, you get 34%, which is pretty much average for these boxes, which is also pretty good for the number of infantry models that you get. Although that sadly for me is where the box falls down a bit. Having 20 of the same unit rather than diversifying a bit is a bit of a shame here, as I would like to see more of the Hearthguard inside instead. But as a core to your army, it's a good starting point to allow you to expand to the really cool models in the range. Mainly the Magmadroths, which used to be in the Start Collecting box many years ago, and the newer Vulcan Flameseekers, who look phenomenal. If you like the aesthetic of the Fyreslayers, and I'm one of those, you can't really go wrong with this one. In terms of the Spearhead format, this is another fairly high skill ceiling faction to play, which can be a lot of fun, even with its lack of varieties at models themselves. You get a big army footprint of some fairly fragile bodies, but in order to make the most of improving the armour and ward saves for some survivability, castling around your Battlesmith is the way to go early on. I'd highly recommend the Firesteel throwing axes to allow you to get some ranged chip damage in before you get into combat, where their melee damage output is really strong. Learning how to utilise your Urgol runes takes some getting used to, but used correctly can make a huge difference. This isn't the most mobile of armies, so utilising Rune of Relentless Zeal could make all the difference for scoring some battle tactics later on in the game. The only recursion you have is through the character's enhancement, the Horn of Grimnir, which I'd highly recommend taking. If you're looking for an army that requires a lot more skill and planning to play correctly than some others, and you love the aesthetic, I'm sure you'll enjoy this one. While not the strongest out there, it's certainly competitive in the right hands. On to everyone's favourite little goblins, and for the Gloomspite Gitz Spearhead, you get 1 Loon Boss, 3 Rockgut Trogguts, 10 Squig Hoppers that can also be built as Boingrot Bounders, and 20 Moonclan Stabbers, which can also be built as Moonclan Shooters. Depending on what you build, this comes in between 610 and 690 points, which sits in the middle of the pack for these boxes, which is a pretty healthy amount. In terms of value, we're looking at 29% discount compared to buying everything separately, which isn't the best, although that's mainly down to the older Stabbers kit, which to be fair at their scale holds up fairly well. So if you're looking at starting this army and don't fancy certain units in this box, then maybe look at another entry point. That being said, you do get a lot of models in this box, with a couple of dual kits thrown in too. The Troggoths and Boingrot Bounders are used in lists right now depending on which sub-faction they specialise in. The model range looks amazing with some giant Trogs, Mangler Squigs and the new Gitmob Wolf Riders, just to name a few. Plus they are so much fun to paint and play that you won't be bored with this faction. If you're looking at this purely from a Spearhead format point of view, I would highly recommend getting it, as it's a very strong box. You have a big army footprint, even with one unit of Squidcoppers only coming in the third battle round as of the December update, which will help you cover the board, plus a versatile set of units. The Stabbers are tougher to shift than you might think, with their -1 to hit nets in combat against infantry, plus keeping the supporting Loon Boss nearby for some good regen makes them a great tar pit. The Troggoths are a really good anvil unit for the centre with some good, albeit swingy damage, but their healing makes up for that. The Squidhoppers are a great fast moving objective taker and able to put out some decent mortal wound chip damage. Unfortunately, they do die to a stiff breeze, so sadly not all that reliable in combat. If their output was a little less swingy, then they would be one of the best in the game, but they are still an exceptional spearhead to play and very strong in the format. Moving on to the Hedonites of Slaanesh now, and inside the Spearhead box you get 1 Shard Speaker of Slaanesh, 3 Slangor Fiendbloods, 5 Slickblade Seekers, which can also be built as Blissbarb Seekers, and then 10 Blissbarb Archers plus 1 Blissbrew Homunculus. This will get you between 560 and 590 points depending on what you build the Seekers as, and a pretty healthy 37% discount on these models, which is pretty much what you'd expect to get from these boxes. The models are fairly new and honestly a stunning set of miniatures for the mortal side of the Slaanesh force. You get a really diverse set of units with a character, ranged infantry, swift cavalry unit, and an elite melee unit inside this box. A nice range of units to see what the army can bring you. It really would be an amazing painting project to undertake, although the Seekers are a little fiddly to put together, so do bear that in mind. Not everything here is being utilised in the top lists if that's something you're taking into consideration, but just starting out with the army, you can't go wrong with this as a great first pickup. Unfortunately, the Spearhead rules don't match up to the quality of the models on display here. While you do get a good range of units, their battle trait really lets them down. The thresholds for me for the depravity points are too high for the buffs, especially if you end up rolling poorly. The run and charge ability typically activates when you don't need that anymore, plus you'd end up helping your opponent out so much to get anywhere near the second or third ability. If the opponent also has a lot of crit abilities, this will really hamper you in offering out the number of dice you probably need to get that online. For me, it certainly needs to be reduced a lot to make it viable. That being said, you do have a lot of great movement from the Archers and Seekers to reposition around the board. The Shard Speaker is just there to try and generate more depravity points, some okay enhancements, but doesn't really affect the game too much. There's also a decent amount of melee punch from the Seekers and Fiendbloods, but don't expect them to last too long in prolonged fights or when left in the open. Sadly, there are no ward saves, which makes the units feel a tad fragile. You'd need to make sure only 1 reinforced unit dies per turn if you can, as the Slangor also have been given the reinforcements keyword in the December update. By no means are they the worst in the game, and with some decent piloting and good rolls on the dice, they can be pretty oppressive. Hopefully in the next update they'll get some help with their battle traits. Time to go under the sea now with the Idoneth Deepkin Spearhead, and inside the box you get 1 Isharan Soulscryer, 1 Achelian Alapex, 3 Achelian Morsar Guard, which can alternatively be built as Achelian Ishling Guard, and 10 Namati Thralls. This will get you between 560 and 570 points depending on which variety of Achelian Guard you want to build them as. In terms of value, you're looking at 30%, which is on the lower end, but certainly more than good enough for these boxes. For me, you get a bit of everything here, which is great. The eels are a good fast-moving melee cavalry, the shark is both decent in ranged and melee, plus slightly tanky, thralls are a good chaff unit, and the soul scryer is a decent character. For someone looking to jump into this army, this ticks a lot of the right boxes. Outside of this, there are a few more characters, the Reavers, which are the ranged version of the Thralls, and of course the Big Turtle, which I absolutely adore. I'd honestly say someone looking to jump into this army that this box is a slam dunk, and if you can offload one of the characters on the secondary market, I'd even suggest two, especially with the eels being a dual kit. In terms of the Spearhead rules themselves, this fast moving force is a lot of fun. The Tides of Death is a cool mechanic that really makes them feel unique, granting them useful bonuses each round with no hoops to go through. If you can keep the eels and shark around for the go turn on battle round 3 with your high tide, you can really go off. You have an incredible amount of movement through your shark and eels, both being fairly tanky, especially if you take the healing ability for your eels, but you won't want to charge them straight into the fray. You definitely need to pick your engagements to be favourable and try not to get them tied up in combat. The Thralls have the potential to do some decent damage, but will die to a stiff breeze. Thankfully, reinforcements help with that, so throwing them forward as a distraction from your sharks and eels and getting one killed early on, especially for a battle tactic, is definitely worth it. The hero is just a buff piece, albeit a pretty good one, that really won't contribute all that much outside that, but if you can keep him alive throughout the game, it'll really add up. Overall, this is a really fun and engaging Spearhead to play. You're looking at around the middle of the park in terms of power level overall, but you have the tools to do some work and be fairly competitive. Onto the Flying Dwarves now, and inside the Kharadron Overlord Spearhead box you get 1 Arcanaut Admiral, 1 Arcanaut Frigate, 3 Endin Riggers which can also be built as Skywardens, and 10 Arcanaut Company models. This allows you to build between 700 and 710 points depending on the multi-part kit, which makes this above average for points in these boxes, and the 40% value you get puts it firmly in the top 5 for value for money compared to buying everything separately. This is mainly down to the frigate being roughly 2/3 of the price of the Spearhead box by itself, which honestly is an essential part of how the army works, so thankfully Games Workshop have kept this in place. You get a really nice mix of units, and I could see a world where 2 boxes is a great starting option, although you may want to sell off the extra character or kit bash it into something else. They have a great aesthetic and fun lore, although the boat might be a little intimidating for a brand new player to build and paint up. All in all, it's a great box and well worth buying at least one to start Kharadron Overlords and expand from. In terms of the Spearhead, it got a sizable buff in the December update, giving reinforcements to both the Arcanaut Company and Skywardens, which has really helped make this force a lot stronger on the tabletop. Unsurprisingly, you get a good amount of shooting with this army. You also have a good board presence now, especially with the addition of reinforcements. One thing to be careful of is not to lose more than one of your reinforceable units per turn. While they have a decent save, they aren't a lot of combined wounds, so can easily be picked off. Picking Disengage for your regiment ability really helps you to not get your boat tied up in combat and shoot after falling back with both weapons. You have a good amount of movement with the boat transporting units and the Skywardens to get objectives or achieve battle tactics. You also get a solid melee general too, who is actually fairly survivable with the Flask of Grogna enhancement, which is a top take now that we have reinforcements. Overall, a pretty competitive update for the Kharadron Spearhead, which firmly puts it towards the middle of the pack, if not slightly higher in terms of power level. Far better than the bottom tier it was languishing in before. If you like the look of this force, you won't be disappointed in how it plays now. Onto the Lumineth Realmlords now, and inside the Spearhead box you get 1 Cenari Cathalar, 5 Venari Bladelords, 10 Venari Aurelin Wardens, and 10 Venari Aurelin Sentinels. This brings you 550 points inside the box, which is definitely on the lower end for these Spearheads. Granted, this is made up by the above average 36% discount you get compared to buying all of these separately. Right off the bat, you do get a good variety of units. A wizard, ranged bowman, spearmen to hold the line, and a unit of really cool looking Venari Bladelords. While these certainly aren't the most exciting units in their range, they're definitely useful to have. I would have loved to have seen some of the cavalry in the box, but that's probably just being a bit greedy. On the tabletop, a Lumineth Realm Lord's army does look beautiful and has a large range to expand upon. One thing to note is these can be a little fiddly to put together, so do bear that in mind, but if you like the look of the army, it's definitely a good point to expand from. When it comes to the Spearhead format, they are sadly a little lackluster. They did just get a buff in the recent December update where you now get lightning reflexes as a passive rather than part of the Facets of War battle trait, which allows you to pick between the other two, which more often than not will be Power of Hish is the one you'd go for. They have decent shooting and melee range, with the crit mortals help keeping the damage fairly consistent. Certainly don't have any extreme damage output, but more of a whittling down. Survivability isn't their strong point either, so planning when to give away a unit to be reinforced is key to this. You don't have much access to much mobility either, which does limit their scoring potential, especially if you want to draw the enemy in to counter with your Blade Lords. You'll also need to keep the Scenari close to your Blade Lords for added survivability, but she's not a particularly great character. It's a solid force overall and probably close to the mid tier. It lacks the tricks and extreme damage output or survivability of the top Spearheads, but with a decent mix of units and good enough shooting means with clever piloting and respawn management you could have a decent time playing them. Onto the Maggotkin of Nurgle now, and inside their Spearhead box we get 1 Soilpox Scrivener, 10 Plague Bearers of Nurgle, 5 Putrid Blight Knights, 2 Plusgoyle Blight Lords, which can also be built as 1 Lord of Afflictions and 1 Plusgoyle Blight Lord. Depending on which variation of the Plusgoyle Blight Lords you build, you can make anywhere between 690 and 780 points, which puts it firmly in the top 5 of all the Spearheads. In terms of value, you're looking at 35%, which puts it about average for these boxes, which is still a good spot. Overall, I think this is a fantastic box to get started with. You get a nice variety of units, all of which are used in a number of different lists. Lots of characterful and interesting sculpts to sink your teeth into hobby-wise, which are a lot of fun to paint. Plus, being Nurgle, the paint jobs certainly don't need to be pristine, so you can have a lot of fun experimenting with different techniques with them. Pair this with the Shudderblight Sis Christmas Battle Force, which is still around in some stores, and you have a great core for your army for a good amount of money off. In terms of the Spearhead format, this is one of the best in the format currently, and certainly a great choice for newer players. Due to the high durability of the force, mistakes while learning aren't punished anywhere near as hard. A 5+ ward save in this format on units with multiple health points is no joke. While the majority of your army doesn't move particularly fast, your Blight Lords help mitigate that. You also have plenty of mortal wound output throughout, especially if the Blight Kings can tie up low health infantry. There's also a good amount of damage throughout the Spearhead rather than in a few selected units. And if teched for, you have some decent healing and recursion for your Plague Bearers. Honestly, one of the best Spearheads in the format, and having not received any changes in the latest update, you could argue it's got even stronger. If you want a really tanky force with good damage and a great set of models, I'd 100% recommend picking this one up. Next up we have the spooky ghosts of the Nighthaunt Spearhead, which brings us 1 Knight of Shrouds, 10 Grimghast Reapers, 20 Chain Rasps and 3 Spirit Hosts. You manage to get 600 points inside the box, which is slightly below average, although that may well come down to the sheer number of cheaper bodies compared to having more elite units. In terms of value, you get a decent 32%, which is slightly below average, although you do get a lot of plastic in the box. At 33 models, you have a lot of options to play with here, and it's a great entry point into the army. It'll certainly keep you busy for a while, although pretty easy to put together bar the Spirit Hosts, which can be a little fiddly. Also worth noting that the Knight of Shrouds on foot can only be gotten from this box, so if you wanted the character, it's also another good reason to grab one when starting. The expanded range has a lot of awesome looking options too, so you'll have plenty to pick from for your next purchases after this box. In terms of the Spearhead format, this is a very decent force that has a lot of good qualities. The entire force ignores rends, which really improves the survivability of the very large footprint this force has. They move pretty quickly, and having fly on all the models gives you a lot more freedom. Great for getting to objectives and completing tactics. They really can become a great tar pit if they manage to charge in first with the Chorus of Terror Regiment ability, which is certainly the most consistent option. The Knight of Shrouds is a great buff piece, particularly with the Spirit Host, that also does some decent work in combat. Crit also wounds across the board help make their damage output a lot more consistent, although certainly not explosive. While you may not have the most damage out there, you've got more than enough tools and board presence to keep the enemy busy while keeping your scoring up. In the right hands, this Spearhead can be competitive, if not potentially a little oppressive in some matchups. If you like the Ghost's aesthetic, it's a box I'd happily recommend getting. Onto the Ogre Mawtribes now, and inside their box you get 1 Tyrant, 1 Iron Blaster which can also be built as a Gnoblar Scrap Launcher, 2 Mournfang Riders, 4 Lead Belchers and 6 Gluttons. This gives you a whopping 930 points, which is top of the pile compared to the rest of the boxes, and nearly half a full army, which is really impressive. Plus you get 36% in value compared to buying directly from Games Workshop, which makes this a fantastic box on paper. I'm a huge fan of the Age of Sigmar sculpts. The overall quality has been outstanding, especially in recent years, but my word are these the exception to the rule. They are pretty dated models which just aren't for me, but with a range refresh I'd imagine this would be one immense looking force. Just because they aren't my cup of tea, please don't let that stop you from getting them. It has a good mixture of units here, and the expanded range with the mounted units do look pretty cool. Their lore is fun, and if this is an army you like the look of, then you can't really go wrong with buying 1 or even 2 boxes here. You should be able to convert the foot hero easily enough, or sell him on the secondary market to make a little money back. When it comes to the Spearhead format, this is an outstanding box to pick up. You get an army with a good amount of survivability. It puts out a lot of damage when they hit, and are active in both phases of the game. You have to be a little more careful post-December update with terms 1 and 2, but once turn 3 hits and the reinforcements come in, it's brutal. You also have a decent amount of movement, especially once your Mournfang pack arrive on the board. Overall, a fairly forgiving force with a lot of great qualities, so if you're looking for one of the best spearheads in the game right now and can get past their looks, this is certainly a box to pick up. The Ironjawz recently got their new Spearhead with the release of the Orruk Warclans Battle Tome, and inside the box you get 1 Mega Boss, 3 Brute Rages which can also be built as Weird Brute Wreckers, 5 Brutes and 10 Ardboys. This comes in at a good 690 points overall, which is above average for these boxes, and you get a healthy 38% discount overall, which makes the box really good value for money. Honestly, this box is a no-brainer if you wanted to get into the Ironjawz side of the faction. They don't have the biggest model ranges, so everything here is generally wanted. They look fantastic and give you a really solid platform to expand upon with some big pigs and the bestest squig. I certainly wouldn't rule out a second box of these either. In terms of the Spearhead, we've got ourselves here a very straightforward force to ease you into the format. It actually has a surprising amount of movement, especially if you take a proper ruckus. The Brutes are a great objective sniper coming in on turn 3 that can really shift objectives held by chaff, and depending on the placement you could even steal 2 from your opponent. Most of the army is pretty sturdy, high wounds and good armor saves, but no ward save or recursion outside the command ability can be an issue with the lower model count. They have very good damage output, albeit can be a little swingy. The Ardboys decimate chaff and are great defensively as a screen taking charges too, perfect for protecting your general and ragers to follow up. One thing to note, don't throw away the ragers needlessly. Their damage output is great, but the 5+ armor save and 9 wounds means they really do need to strike first. All in all, a simple but fun Spearhead which does what you pretty much imagine the army wants to do: tie everything up and crack skulls. Not top tier, but certainly a lot of fun. Onto the other half of the Orruks now, and we have the Kruelboyz Spearhead box, which contains 1 Killer Boss on Great Gnashtooth, 1 Merc Knob with Belcher Banner, 1 Beast Skewer Killbow, 3 Man Skewer Bolt Boys and 10 Gut Rippers. This brings us a total of 690 points from the box, which is middle of the pack and a good start to an army. In terms of value, it's a little more complex. As you can't buy the characters outside of the box, I've had to estimate them here, giving us a total of 45%. However, the secondary market could well be a great place to pick them up, with people still having old Dominion boxes, which gives you everything you need in the Spearhead, apart from the Beast Skewer Killbow for a lot less than this box costs. I've even seen the Kruelboyz half of the Dominion box, which gives you a lot more models for £50 here in the UK. Which, with buying a separate Killbow, puts this comfortably under the cost of the Spearhead, and you get a lot more models for your money. In terms of the box itself, I really do love the sneaky aesthetic of these orcs. It's really nice to differentiate them from the typical big smashy orcs we all know and love. You get a good variety of units, 2 characters, artillery piece, plus a ranged and combat unit. It's honestly a really good box if you're new to this faction. Just have a look at the alternative way to purchase this before committing. Your wallet will thank me later. In terms of the Spearhead game itself, it's a solid force with a good amount of tactical depth, which does reward better players. Your battle trait is huge for this army, not only for countering alpha striking turn 1 charging armies, but also a really good deterrent. Comboing this with Noisy Racket really makes your survivability and output on turn 1 fantastic. All of their melee weapons have crit mortals, which really helps their damage output, although it can be very swingy. It's also nice to have a combination of ranged and melee units, but you want to try and screen your Bolt Boys and Killbow if possible to allow them to pick off or soften up units for your Gut Rippers to finish off. This is a good mid-tier Spearhead, which with some good piloting can be competitive. Plus, if you spike on your dice, your output can be insane. It's a really fun Spearhead, and I'm sure you'll have a great time playing with it. Next up, we have the Ossiarch Bonereapers, and inside the Spearhead you get 1 Mortisan Soul Reaper, 1 Gothisar Harvester, 5 Kavalos Death Riders, and 20 Mortek Guard. This pretty stacked box makes you 750 points, which is comfortably inside the top 5 for all of the boxes. Backed up by a 35% value makes this a pretty good pickup. One note is the Mortisan Soul Reaper isn't available on the Warhammer website, although I did manage to find one on an online store. One of a number of characters that seem to be locked in these boxes. Honestly though, this is a fantastic Spearhead box to get started with. You get a good diverse range of models with a wizard character, 20 infantry, a cavalry unit and a monster. And it's great to see that bigger centerpiece units are still in Spearhead when the combat patrol boxes in 40k are slowly removing them all. The Ossiarch Bonereapers are a faction that looks like a traditional army on the tabletop, and their greater range has a lot of really cool options to expand to. They're also pretty quick to paint up too, with a lot of bone that is great for dry brushing. The 20 Mortek Guard inside the box stops this from being a buy multiple of, but definitely worth grabbing one to get started with. In terms of the Spearhead gameplay, this is a solid force that sits comfortably in the middle of the pack. It's a nice composition of a force with durable infantry, quick cavalry, and a distraction in the form of the Harvester. They 100% prefer going first to get that Mortek Guard in place to be charged for the extra rend to crack back with after popping impenetrable ranks to help with their survivability. They potentially get +2 rend if you take the Empower Nadrite weapons. While it's nice to have the reinforcements coming in at turn 3, the fact they are 4-inch move really does hurt them. Drain Vitality is a fantastic spell in this format on your Mortisan Soul Reaper, and it's actually pretty strong. While their commands are really cool abilities, only being able to use 2 per battle round rather than player turn doesn't feel like enough to get the most out of this force. Overall, it's a great looking army with a lot of interesting tools to deal with whatever you come up against. While it's not without its flaws, it's a solid middle tier box that can compete in the right hands. You certainly won't be disappointed with it. On to everyone's favourite lizards riding dinosaurs now with the Seraphon, and inside their Spearhead box we get 1 Saurus Old Blood on Carnosaur, which can alternatively be built as either the Saurus Scar Veteran on Carnosaur or a Skink Oracle on Troglodon with a Saurus Old Blood on foot. Then you get 3 Kroxigor, which can also be built as Kroxigor Warspawned, and 10 Saurus Warriors. This gets you between 660 and 730 points depending on what you build, which does put this as one of the highest boxes. In terms of value, it comes in at 34%, which is about average for these boxes, so certainly good enough. Plus, being able to get 2 characters out the Carnosaur kit for me adds more value to this box than the number suggests. The aesthetic of this army is so much fun and one of my favourites in the entire game. I mean, it's not a hard sell for anyone to have an army of lizards riding dinosaurs. They're just so cool. The box contents are really solid and again a pretty easy sell. You get a good troop unit, elite melee unit, and of course a mounted hero on a Carnosaur, which has multiple build options. It's a fun hobby project too and suits a wide variety of colour schemes. In terms of the Spearhead format, it's in a really good place. The Spearhead is pretty straightforward to play, which makes them a great pickup for someone new to Age of Sigmar. You get 3 war scrolls with plenty of movement, health and damage output. Most of the abilities for the army are either ways to do more damage or give them a bit more survivability in order to continue their beatdown. A lack of ward saves can be an issue against the mortal wounds output of some forces, but otherwise fairly durable. While eating a model most turns with the general in combat is pretty fun and very thematic, the general's raw may well prove to be more valuable more often than not. Overall, this is a really good Spearhead with excellent looking models, and the simple yet effective gameplay really is enjoyable to play. If you like the look of the models, for me this is an absolute no-brainer. Up first for the Skaven, we have the Gnawfeast Clawpack Spearhead found in the Skaven Tide and Ultimate Starter Set boxes, which contains 1 Clawlord on Gnawbeast, 1 Grey Seer, 1 Warlock Engineer, 3 Rat Ogres and 20 Skaven Clan Rats. This will net you 690 points in total in this character heavy Spearhead, which is about average for these boxes. Value wise, I've estimated this at 41%, as not all of the characters are available separately. That being said, these contents are only available in the Ultimate Starter Set with the Stormcast later on in the video, or the Skaven Tide box, but the secondary market will be filled with these models for a lot cheaper. Although either of these boxes are great if you wanted to grab 2 Spearheads in one go at a cheaper price than 2 separate Spearheads. As for the contents themselves, you get a very diverse set of models from the new range refresh. A mounted character, wizard, ranged character, an elite unit of rat ogres and 20 of the new clan rats. It's not the most cohesive box on its own as it has models from a variety of different clans, but it gives you a good selection of models to expand upon with their absolutely exceptional rework. Definitely not something I imagine you'll want multiples of, but there are plenty of individual units on the secondary market pretty cheap that can help you expand your forces for less. In terms of the Spearhead rules themselves, they're a pretty decent force with a good number of tools at your disposal. The Clan Rats are a great tar pit and screen for your more important units. While they aren't the most durable, getting D3 back at the end of every turn and reinforceable makes them more of a nuisance than you may think. Gnawhole for me is a bit of a trap. In some circumstances it can be useful to pop a single character out, but competent players will be able to counter this fairly easily. The Clawlord on Gnawbeast is a great foot character killer, especially if you can get a wound or 2 on him. 8 attacks at 3s to hit and 4s to wound at rend 1 damage 2 is no joke. The Rat Ogres you want to try and keep safe until they have a favourable charge. They hit pretty hard but aren't the most durable of units. Also, unless you know that you'll wipe out the unit with the Unleashed Warp Fury ability, it's certainly not worth utilising. Overall, you have a good variety of units, plenty of heavy hitters and some good ranged attacks to soften up your opponent before charging in. While it's not up there with the top tier Spearheads, it's solid enough that you'll still have plenty of fun with this. Onto the other Skaven Spearhead we have access to with the Warp Spark Clawpack, and inside the box you get 1 Grey Seer, 20 Clan Rats, 3 Storm Fiends and 1 Warp Lightning Cannon. This gives you 670 points, which is pretty solid and about average for these boxes. In terms of value, you only get 25%, which is pretty low, and honestly, if you've already gotten the Skaven Tide box and wanted to try this out, just grabbing a Warp Lightning Cannon and Storm Fiends would do the trick to save a bit of money. Just to note, this older version of the Grey Seer is only available in this box if you'd like an alternative, And make sure if you do grab this box, get the rebranded Spearhead box rather than the older Vanguard one, so you don't also get the older Clanrat sculpts. While the box isn't the highest value for money, it's certainly a more cohesive force than the newer Spearhead with a good amount of ranged threats. The Stormfiends are really cool and the Warp Lightning Cannon is just iconic. As long as you have the updated Spearhead version of the box, this is still a good pickup if you want everything inside. In terms of the Spearhead format, this is a very solid force to play and sitting in the A tier for me. There are a lot of great movement shenanigans available to you here. 3 claw steps ahead being after the enemy movement allows you to potentially make their charge impossible or put a screening unit in the way of your more valuable assets. And Skitter Leap is a fantastic enhancement too to allow your Grey Seer to jump around the board and score you plenty of points. Your Stormfiends and Warp Lightning Cannon are your heavy hitters, and you'll want to utilise the tar pit of the Clanrats to screen those from your opponent to deal a lot of damage. Definitely focus firing down the most lethal enemy at a time is the best bet with these. This for me is the slightly better Skaven Spearhead of the two to play. You get plenty of range damage output and enough movement to either protect these or score points. While not quite top tier, they're still sitting as a lower A tier box for me. Onto the Forces of Chaos now, and inside the Slaves to Darkness Bloodwind Legion Spearhead you get 1 Chaos Lord, 1 Chaos Chariot which can also be built as a Gore-Beast Chariot, 10 Chaos Warriors and 5 Chaos Knights. This gives you between 630 and 650 points depending on what you build the chariot as, which is about average for these boxes. This then comes in at 30% discount compared to buying all the models individually, which is slightly on the lower end but still pretty good. This is a really diverse box and offers you a really good starting point for the Slaves to Darkness army. A hero on foot, Chaos Warriors and Knights which both look fantastic, with the latter being a great cavalry option and a chariot with build options. Really is a nice set of models to get started with, and I do love the aesthetic of them. Some of these models are push fit, which with a little tinkering do go together well enough. For me, this Spearhead is a solid base to expand from into the massive range of models that they have in their catalogue, which you won't be disappointed with, I can assure you. In terms of the Spearhead format, even with the slight nerf they got in the December update where the Knights now set up on the second battle round rather than at the start, coupled with the Dread Banner hit as a result dropped them a little bit, but they're still a really good force. You get plenty of movement with the Knights and the Chariot, with the former being really heavy lifters for this Spearhead, some of the best cavalry in the game. They have good armour saves throughout, which gives them a fair amount of durability, especially with good rolls on the Eyes of the God table, the Blessing of Nurgle being a substantial buff to their defensive profile. This table can be a little confusing to keep track of for newer players, but once you've played a couple of games with them, you'll learn to love it. It's not something you want your whole gameplay to rely on, but if you can achieve the criteria each turn without affecting your battle tactics, it's 100% worth doing. If you do roll a 6 and get to pick, Khorne is your best bet if you need the damage, especially against higher armoured spearheads. Then it's Nurgle followed by Tzeentch for me in terms of adding to your unit's durability. The Chariot is actually a really useful unit. While not doing a huge amount of damage, due to its footprint size, can be really annoying for the opponent to deal with, and a perfect roadblock that can tie up a good amount in combat. And for me, the Mark of Slaanesh enhancement on the Chaos Lord is a big deterrent for people trying to charge a unit he's close to. He hits pretty hard, especially when buffed. Overall, this is still an A tier Spearhead for me, with plenty of movement, durability and damage available to you. Its nerf did drop it down to A tier from S, but it's still really strong and a great set of models to play with. Onto the newest Spearhead for the Slaves to Darkness with the amazing looking Dark Oath models, and inside the box you get 1 Dark Oath War Queen, 5 Dark Oath Fell Riders, 10 Dark Oath Savagers and 10 Dark Oath Marauders. This nets you a meagre 450 points, which is one of the lowest here, mainly due to the Dark Oath being the Horde Marauders for the faction. On the plus side, as they are newer models in the range, you do still receive a pretty good amount of value in the box at 35%. The majority of these models have only been around for about a year and are amazing looking sculpts. Having jumped onto the Cities of Sigmar myself when the new kits were released, as I like the whole normal men and women trying to survive in this universe, these for me fall under the same category. You get a nice mix of the cavalry and 2 different combat units in there, plus the War Queen as your leader. If I didn't already have too much in my pile of potential, I definitely would have grabbed this box, and if you like the range here, it's a great box to start from. If you are interested in this force, I'd also highly recommend reading the Dark Oath novel from the Black Library and the story of Gunnar Brand. It was a really enjoyable book where you get to know this force a lot better. In terms of the Spearhead, they're a pretty fun force to play, albeit not quite as beginner friendly as some. Their battle trait is really where the strength of the Spearhead lies. Being able to get bonus commands to use later in the game by achieving a battle tactic that you make your oath that turn is fantastic. There are a fair number like rerolling a charge, countercharging, reinforcing a unit or getting a ward save that could really make a difference, all while scoring points. This then helps elevate the power level of some fairly fragile units with no rend, outside their regiment ability and 1 enhancement. So you'll have to pick your fights carefully. Having reinforcements on both the Felriders and Marauders gives you some ways to screen or achieve objectives where you won't be too unhappy when they die. That being said, try not to lose both on the same turn. You'll want to try and keep the commander and savages safe if you can to come in and deal the finishing blow to a unit, as they are your heavier hitters. The commander's buff of +1 to hit is pretty good and allows you to pass that on in the hero phase before deciding where you'd like to charge and utilise it. Try keeping her centred to leave as many options as possible in her 12-inch range. It's a pretty decent horde style spearhead with some cool abilities here for you to utilise. While not the strongest out there, with a good pilot and potentially getting lucky with the cards, you'll have a mobile force that can compete. Onto the Sons of Behemat box now, which we mentioned earlier was slightly more expensive than the others. We get just 3 Man Crusher Gargants. This nets you 390 points, which is the lowest of the lot, and honestly for the extra price this box is compared to the others, the 26% value you get out of it isn't particularly great. While it is technically a discount if you actually wanted 3 of them, I'd wager the majority of people that wanted to get into this faction were after the bigger Mega Gargants, which do look infinitely cooler. On the plus side for the Gargants box, there are a lot of options in these kits, which makes the hobbying side interesting, but unless you know you're after these specifically, I'd be more tempted to get one of the bigger models for a tiny bit more money. As for the Spearhead format, I'm afraid this is one of the worst boxes currently in the game. Board control is a big issue for them, both due to the lack of numbers and easy to block off routes. They don't hit as hard as you may think due to the swingy damage, and despite their size, they're deceptively easy to kill. If they get stuck in an unfavourable position, they struggle to get out of it and easily kited. They are very much a force that if your opponent isn't skilled or plays too cagey against them, you have a chance, else is an extremely uphill battle. They do rely on going first so that they don't get blocked off in their deployment zone. If you are thinking about grabbing this box purely for Spearhead, I'd honestly give it a miss. It really doesn't give you an enjoyable experience, and there are plenty of other boxes which give you an easier time or more tactical options depending what you'd like to get out of it. Moving on to the current Soulblight Gravelords box, and inside you get 1 Vampire Lord, 3 Vargheists, 5 Blood Knights and 20 Death Rattle Skeletons. This gives you a healthy 720 points, which is above average for these boxes, which alongside a 36% value compared to buying everything separately from Games Workshop, makes this a great box on paper. I'm a big fan of this box, and the updated Death Rattle Skeletons that came in the Cursed City game look fantastic. Some of my favourite skeleton sculpts in the entire game. The Blood Knights are also great looking models, and you get one of the many different vampires from the range. While the Vargheists do look a little dated, they're still a decent enough looking model for the Soulblight's model range. There is a really nice new set of models coming soon at the time of recording, alongside some great looking models in their extended range, so if you're a fan of the undead and vampires, this is definitely a box to jump on. It's got a nice composition of units in the box and one I'd highly recommend picking up to start your army. In terms of the Spearhead rules, this is still a pretty strong Spearhead even with the slight nerf they got in the December update. The Death Rattle skeletons aren't quite as oppressive as they used to be, with the Skeleton Legion ability only being in your combat phase rather than any, although it's still a good tar pit. Plus the Endless Legions Regiment ability is now stronger than ever with the change. The Blood Knight Cavalry are still fantastic, with a great amount of movement and a really useful passive. While the Vampire Lord isn't the strongest in the format, if you can screen it with the skeletons, it can drain down a unit or two very safely while healing itself back up to full. The Vargheist coming in turn 3 give you another fast moving option depending where you need them on the board for scoring or finishing off a unit. This is still a very good Spearhead on the table with a good amount of units, healing and a fast moving hammer with the Blood Knights. While not quite as strong as it was before, it's still one of the better boxes around. Onto the first of the Stormcast Spearheads, we have the Vigilant Brotherhood found in the Skaventide and Ultimate Starter Set boxes, which contain 1 Lord Vigilant on Gryffstalker, 1 Lord Veritant with 1 Gryffcrow, 3 Prosecutors and 5 Liberators. This nets you 540 points in total, which is one of the lowest compared to the rest, and a 27% value compared to buying everything separately, with some slight estimated prices as not everything is available separately yet. This doesn't make for great reading, although it's a little misleading as these contents are only available in the Ultimate Starter Set with the Skaven or the Skaventide box. Each of these works out better value for money if you fancy getting both or splitting with someone else or selling on the secondary market. If you're just after one, I'd highly suggest popping onto the secondary market like eBay, as you'll be able to grab it for a lot cheaper unless of course you want both. In terms of the models, they are really nice sculpts. I'm personally a huge fan of the new Prosecutors, which I think are one of the best kits from the newest Stormcast range. They're all pretty easy to put together, although push fit, which you can easily work around if you prefer. While there aren't an awful lot of models here, you do get a mounted and non-mounted character, a fast-moving troop, and a solid set of Liberators. So it's not really a bad start to a force at all really, although if you're interested in these Stormcast, I'd personally be looking for a Skaventide half to get started with, just to get you better value for money with 2 more characters, 5 more Liberators, and the more elite unit of Reclusians, which also look great. In terms of the Spearhead rules, this is a very elite force that does rely on both the Liberators and Prosecutors being reinforceable, which you'll need to make sure that they don't die on the same turn to take full advantage of this. The Shield of Azir change being once per turn rather than once per game does help with the survivability of a key unit. Plus, if you take the ward on the leader as well, makes the force quite tanky with 3+ armor and 5+ wards on 3 out of 4 of them. You've got 2 fast moving units to give you a bit more flexibility in scoring and finding advantageous combats. They're also great alpha striking units too. Your Lord Vigilant and Liberators are your hard hitting units, and the General's once per game fight twice ability on the Liberators can be devastating. Overall, it's a solid and pretty straightforward Spearhead to use. It sits comfortably in the middle of the pack in terms of power level and not a bad one to start with either, although it can struggle due to numbers in certain matchups. Next we have the second Stormcast Eternal Spearhead, which is part of the 3rd edition starter boxes with Indrasta. Inside you get 1 Indrasta the Celestial Spear, 1 Knight Vexillor with the Banner of Apotheosis, 1 Stormstrike Chariot, 3 Annihilators and 10 Vanquishers. This comes in at 840 points inside the box, which is one of the highest of all of them. This high spot also comes with the 49% value inside the box, although some of these values were estimated due to not being able to buy some models outside of it. Plus, some being monopost too might bring the value down in your eyes. That being said, you may well be able to find this or the Dominion halves still on the secondary market even cheaper for more value for money. That comes with everything bar the Chariot, which may well make it cheaper overall. If you don't own an Indrasta already, which is where the biggest point sink comes from in this box, then it's a really good deal. In terms of the box itself for newer players, this is a great pickup. The models are easy to build and paint up in whichever scheme you prefer, although maybe with the exception of Indrasta and the Chariot. They also look really good, and Andrasta especially is a beautiful model. The expanded Stormcast range is huge, especially with what 4th edition brought as well, so you won't be limited in what to purchase next. Overall, a really good box, although if you already have Andrasta, I definitely avoid it. In terms of the Spearhead rules, it's a pretty solid force overall. You start with the Vanquishers, Chariot and Night Vexillor on the board for the first 2 turns, before your heavy hitters of Andrasta and the Annihilators come down on turn 3 to swing the game. This means you tend to play a bit cagey early on, and then hope to be only a couple of points behind to swing it in your favour when they come in. Andrasta and the Annihilators pack a really good punch into just about everything in this format, although if the Vanquishers go into anything with 5+ models, they do some serious work. The Chariot, while it looks cool, is just there to cap objectives on the other side of the board, and due to its large base size, make it awkward for opponents to move around. Plus, if you can utilise the heal from the Night Vexillor on it once or twice, it can become a real hassle to deal with. Not the most punchy of units though, so do bear that in mind. Overall, a solid mid-tier Spearhead force that if your charges come off on turn 3, can pack a real punch. It's just a case of whether you are too far behind before they come in points-wise to make a difference. This also plays very differently to the other Stormcast Spearhead too, so if you like that faction and want to have more than one playstyle option, it's certainly worth considering. Last of all, we come to the Sylvaneth Spearhead, and inside the box you get 1 Branch Witch, 1 Tree Lord which can also be built as a Tree Lord Ancient or Spirit of Durthu, 3 Kurnoth Hunters with multiple weapon options, and 5 Tree Revenants which can also be built as Spite Revenants. This nets you between 610 and 740 points depending on which variation of the models you build, which is a really solid amount. In terms of value, it's again a solid 36% compared to buying everything separately from Games Workshop, and with a few kits having multiple options, it potentially makes it even better. At first glance you may feel that the number of models you get in here is a bit lacking, although I would say that due to the build options, picking up a second wouldn't be a bad idea to flesh out the army at a good price. Aesthetically, I think they look fantastic, and I'm sure you'll have a great time hobbying with them. I imagine they're pretty easy to paint up with heavy dry brushing adding texture to the bark ahead of the contrast paints. It's a great starting point for the army, and the expanded range is stunning too, with some incredible looking characters like Alariel and Belthanos and more great units. It's one I'm sure you'll have a lot of fun collecting. I would definitely recommend buying one of these, and with the build options, multiple is definitely on the table. In terms of the Spearhead format, this is one of the best forces in the game right now. While the model count may not seem too high, they have a huge amount of sustainability, movement and tools to deal with pretty much everything. Positioning around terrain features is key for this army to allow it to use its incredible movement around the board with either Walkers of the Hidden Path and Strike and Fade. They really help you to snipe unattended objectives from your opponent, score battle tactics and keep your units safer. Plus, with ley lines being next to a terrain feature adds to the survivability with healing. Top that up with the Branch Witch taking regrowth and it could really make the Tree Lord almost unkillable. On top of the healing, using your unit of Tree Revenants to screen your Hunters near a terrain feature while both touching an objective really adds to its survivability. Picking +1 to save in combat, 6+ ward from the Hunters and regenning any that die with the Branch Witch makes for a really good wall. And even if they die with reinforcements, you'll get another squad back too. And once they've done their job, you can use your movement shenanigans to teleport them around the board for capping objectives. You also have really good range damage with the Kurnoth and Tree Lord to pick off an enemy threat before it gets to you. Overall, this is a fantastic Spearhead to play. Plenty of tools and options for any game, and their movement really does make them a problem to deal with, but not in an overpowered, unbalanced way. Definitely top tier for me. So there we have all of the Spearhead boxes, and honestly there is a high number of these that are really good pickups, especially starting out. There are of course some which are debatable unless you like all the units in these boxes. I'm looking at you Sons of Behemat and Disciples of Tzeentch. Plus, with a few factions I can recommend getting multiple boxes of them, which really shows the quality of some of these boxes. Overall, there are more than enough good options here to get a good discount and start your journey onto the tabletop. While this is just a guide from myself to inform you what you can expect to get from their value, at the end of the day it's up to you whether you'd like to buy a box or not. What value is from one person to another can be completely different, and as long as you're having fun in the hobby, that's all that matters. If you've come looking at this purely for the Spearhead format gameplay side of things, you won't be disappointed with the vast majority of these. While there are some that are stronger than others, you can have some really great games on the tabletop with most, and with good play, often some of the lower tier ones can punch up well. It's a really great format that's balanced pretty well for the most part, and I can't wait to see what Games Workshop do to expand upon this going forward. Let me know in the comment section below what your favourite Spearhead is, and if you've ever started or thinking of starting an army with one. I'd love to know. If you enjoyed the video and found it useful, please do hit that like and subscribe button, as it really helps the channel to grow. Thank you so much for watching the command phase, and I'll see you in the next video.